Poetry Slam is a spoken word poetry competition where poets can say whatever they want, however they want, as long as it's written by the poet and is read within the time limit. But with an infinite amount of topics to cover and no set standard to judge by, not only does it make judging the slam difficult, but it also makes following slam as a sport way harder than it should be. This is why we came up with a new format called the Poetry Clash. I'm Koya David, one half of the most poppin' poetry podcast, the Pen Clique. And in this video, we're gonna reintroduce you to the Poetry Clash and show how we're addressing aspects of the slam system that we're modifying to create a more streamlined, prize-fighting style of poetry competition. Now, I say reintroduce because we actually did this 5 years ago. It's how Daniel Hees and I met. We got to building a relationship, and that's how the Pen Clique Poetry Podcast formed, and it would take up a lot of our creative time. But like a lot of y'all that have picked up old projects and hobbies during lockdown, we decided to revisit the Poetry Clash to see if we can do it better this time around, having learned a ton of production skills from our podcast and our video content. Like many spoken word heads, I'm a huge fan of battle rap. URL, RBE, King of the Dot, Don't Flop, even grime clashes, I love it all. And I always wondered, how did battle rap grow to be such a worldwide phenomenon compared to Poetry Slam, which has existed for almost as long as hip hop itself? And how is it that battle rap can seem so much easier to follow than a Poetry Slam? Let's first look at how a Poetry Slam is conducted versus a rap battle. A Poetry Slam is always a bracketed tournament. The smallest slams I've seen were about 6 people, and the largest individual slams can be up to 100 people. So imagine, you're judging a Poetry Slam with 16 poets. You're watching the first poet go, and they're pretty good. You give them an 8.5. Then a couple more poets go, and then all of a sudden you see this awesome poet that gives you a 10 piece. Now you're hyped and you see the next poet go, they give a pretty solid performance, and you're so hyped, you give them a 9. But wait, the first poet you saw also had a super solid piece, and you only gave them an 8.5, so how come this poet gets a 9? This is the phenomenon in the slam world called score creep. It's when scores start to rise as the slam progresses, giving an unfair disadvantage to the beginning poets. Slam organizers try to offset this by having a sacrificial poet in the beginning, which might work for small 6-person slams, but for larger ones, it's really difficult to prevent. In a rap battle, however, it's 1 versus 1. Score creep isn't even possible because when you're comparing 2 rappers against each other, you're no longer trying to rate an isolated individual verse on an imaginary scale out of 10. Pretty much, if you liked what rapper A said more than rapper B, then rapper A won the round. Simple as that. Speaking of 1 versus 1, by shrinking down the competition to only be 1-on-1, the narrative gets way simplified for the audience. In a bracket tournament poetry slam, it's difficult to follow poets when there's a ton of competitors to listen through. But when it's only 1-on-1, all you have to do is pick a side. This is why fandom for battle rappers is easier to build and follow, because we're only following one artist in these battles instead of a whole bracket's worth. Lastly, the poems and poetry slam are usually practiced to perfection by performing them at a multitude of open mics, smaller local slams, and at featured performances, which is great. The dope part is that at a slam, you know that this is the best version of the poem you're probably gonna hear. The problem is that if you travel in the same poetry circles, you might have heard this poem a dozen times already, and it doesn't have the same impact as it would have if it were fresh. In battle rap, unless you're spitting generic mixtape bars, every verse being heard was specifically tailored and written for their opponent, and you will never hear that again unless you rewatch that battle online. This is what gives rap battles such high replay value, because that battle is the only place you will ever hear those rhymes being performed. It's guaranteed to be fresh when you watch the battle for the first time. Inspired by the simplified format of battle rap, as well as recognizing the added value of guaranteed fresh content, the Poetry Clash is a retooled poetry format, streamlined to allow for easier following, a level playing field for judging, and guaranteed fresh new poems for audiences to experience. The Poetry Clash is a 1 versus 1 poetry competition. By having only 2 poets compete against each other, the audience will have direct poems to compare against, but this only works if the poems can be compared. A A weird thing about slam is that the freedom of performing whatever you want means that you'll hear intimate stories, which is awesome. The problem is that it can be comparing apples to oranges. Like if poet A, for example, writes a poem about their love life, and then poet B performs a piece about their grandparents dying in a war, two very difficult things to compare against. This is why, for the Poetry Clash, we're leveling the playing field by giving poets ahead of time prompted themes and poetry forms. This means that the poets will be performing fresh, new poems written to the same theme or same style. By doing so, we're taking care of a few key issues. 1. These are freshly written poems specifically for the competition, so you're not going to hear any oldies or reruns on this channel. 2. By having the poets write to the same theme, it gives judges better context to compare and contrast the poems against. It's up to the poets to interpret these things however they want, but at least it gives the judges a center point they can anchor their voting with. 3. By also including poetry forms, we're challenging the poets to step out of their comfort zone to adapt to different poetry formats that they might not have normally tried out. So you can have a poet that's super dope at multi-syllabic rhyming, but suddenly give them a sestina poetry form and they won't be able to rely on the same trick that pushed them through. We think that the Poetry Clash is a fresh take on the poetry competition format that will engage the audience with heated debate about who they think won, make it easier to follow the poets who clash, and hopefully create a new type of fandom and fame for the poetry culture. This is the Poetry Clash. If you're excited about the Poetry Clash or know somebody who would be good on our platform, let us know in the comments and be sure to subscribe so you don't miss out on any Clash announcements and matches. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the ring.